Our Torah reading is from, we use in our community, the Eitz Chaim Chumash. And the reading for this Shabbat is in honor of Sukkot. We're only one reading, one parsha from finishing the cycle of the 5 books of Moses. But that will not be done this Shabbat. That will not be done next Shabbat. That will be done a week from tomorrow when we mark Simchat Torah with the reading of the Zot HaBracha, Moses' final words, and these shall be a blessing, which then immediately starts the reading of Torah over with Bereshit. This morning, in honor of Sukkot, the Torah reading from what would be the first of the 2 scrolls is from Leviticus chapter 22, going through the end of, continuing through 23, that describes the 3 pilgrimage holidays, the biblical holidays, which are Pesach, the holiday of freedom, Shavuot, which the rabbis will understand as the holiday of the receiving of Torah, and today, the holiday of Sukkot, which the rabbis will call Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. I add what the rabbis understand, for in our Torah reading, these 3 pilgrimage holidays are each identified as a time of agricultural harvest, when our ancestors were largely farmers or herders. On these times of gathering the crops, there was reason to celebrate. And so 3 times a year, people would come as pilgrims, bringing offerings of celebration before God, which distinctly in our tradition would be given a historical overlay, so that each of these pilgrimage holidays, this time of communal gathering, was not only to celebrate the bounty that was a harvest, but also to acknowledge the harvest of memory. In the case of Sukkot, the memory of the journey through the desert, in which, as the Torah does record, we traveled in makeshift tents, that of Sukkot, and those huts we rebuild on this, the holiday, both to remind us of the huts of harvest, but also the huts of those 40 years of journey from servitude to the responsibilities of independence in the Promised Land. Our Maftir reading, the 2nd scroll, deals with the specific offerings that were brought on the days of Sukkot. And our Haftorah, the reading that is linked with our Torah readings, is from the book of Zechariah, chapter 14. Zechariah is among the last of the prophets. He's already a prophet who preached just on the cusp of the return of the Israelites who were taken away by the Babylonians in 586. His preaching in this case is dated around 518, so that would be within close to 40 years of that particular 50 years of that exile. And in this Haftorah, there's explicit link to the holiday of Sukkot, saying, gather for celebration for Sukkot, lest you be punished and God withhold the rain for you. And the rabbis will emphasize that the holiday of Sukkot was the holiday on the cusp of the rainy season, rains that the crops of Israel depended on in order to flourish. And so the holiday of Sukkot will conclude with certain prayers for rain, and that is also in our Haftorah. And with that, a short teaching about Sukkot. This year, as I sat with Linda last night to mark the beginning of Sukkot, reciting with Kiddush the bracha, the blessing, Leishev Basukah. It is the mitzvah to sit in a sukkah, to do so, to eat one's meals there. As we sat and recited that blessing and the Shechianu, I was reminded of what was missing. What was missing from our sukkah were guests. For Sukkot is a dramatic contrast to Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, just this last Sunday night and Monday, is the time of going inward, the time of being self-reflective. When Yom Kippur ends, we shift in our focus to being outwardly oriented, to taking a hammer in some cases, or in my case, a wrench to tighten bolts, to begin to look at nature, to build a sukkah. And then, with the beginning of the holiday itself, to harvest friends. For on this holiday, Zman Simchatenu, the time of rejoicing, we are taught of the importance of company. Not just company that is with us as we invite family and friends to share a meal in our sukkah, but the rabbis, the mystics, would teach that for each of the 7 days of the dwelling in the sukkah, we have a biblical guest. The Aramaic word for such a guest is ushpizin. And for the rabbis from the 16th century on who created this particular custom of biblical guests, those 7 guests not only represent, if you will, today, last night, the inviting of Abraham into our sukkah to join our family and friends, but also are a quality not unlike that focus that we had between Pesach and Shavuot to cultivating certain inner qualities of personality. So even now with Sukkot, we are using these guests to remind us of how to be more fully ourselves. Abraham, for instance, is identified with the sphira, the mystical emanation of kindness. You recall that Abraham and Sarah were particularly identified with the mitzvah of hospitality. For Abraham and Sarah are identified with looking how they could welcome others into their presence. In fact, the chuppah of a bride and groom is a tent that reminds us of Abraham and Sarah's tent, open on all 4 sides. And so tonight and tomorrow, our guest will be Yitzchak. The quality of self-restraint and discipline. The 3rd day will be Yaakov, that of harmony. And so the 7 guests, these biblical figures, are also prompts for our own self-reflection, which leads me to a story that I read from Rabbi Abraham Twersky, a psychiatrist who has much to teach about the human condition, who tells a story of Pinchas of Koretz. But as Amy was leading our prayers this morning, I saw that as Shacharit began, there was a quote of Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, of whom this story I'll tell in a moment. Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz here on page 147 is quoted with a little saying entitled, "The Presence of God." Quote, "The prayers that you pray are the very presence of God." Pinchas of Koretz in this story was known for being a magnet for other people. He had a quality of charisma that just drew people to him. And it was such that in all times there were those who would be knocking on his door or wishing to be in his presence. And he said, "Dear God, I love these people, but there's too many distractions. I pray that I should have the benefit of being left alone so that I would be able to pray and to study and to have that quiet that I frankly long for." And by virtue of the status of his heartfelt prayer, it so came to be that the knock on the doors stopped, and Pinchas of Koretz found himself with remarkable quiet. His wife soon after returned from the market, and she said, "My husband, when I would go to the market, people would gather around me and smile and welcome me and even give me free samples. I was always greeted as a warm friend. But now I just went to the market, and it was as if I was given a cold shoulder by everybody in the market. Nobody approached me." And the rabbi smiled and he says, "My wife, I'm sorry. I prayed that I would be left alone so that I could study in quiet, and apparently it was also the case by extension for you. So I apologize if people no longer seek out your company, but I really do welcome some quiet." And so he continued to enjoy his study and his prayer. But Sukkot was coming. And on the first day of Sukkot, as he sat alone with his wife together, he became aware that even Abraham, the Ushpezin, the visitor who comes on the first day of Sukkot, was not entering the Sukkah. And so he yelled out from whose Sukkah, "Abraham, Abraham, come in, join us. It's a time of celebration." And Abraham replied, "I'm sorry, but it was my way to welcome people into my home at all times. My tent was open on all four sides, for with my wife Sarah, there was always a priority on welcoming others into our midst. And frankly, without others in your midst, it doesn't feel right for me to be the first to enter. It feels as if it's not a place of welcome." And so the tale goes that Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz closed his eyes as he sat in his sukkah, and he said, "Ribono shel Olam, Master of the universe, I change my plea. May all those who were drawn to me continue to find me welcoming. May others join me in the sukkah, for I am reminded that to be in the presence of others is not only to do the mitzvah of welcome, hachnasat orchim, but it is to feel in celebration of life." And with that, in a moment, there were others who appeared at the sukkah, and they entered, and Abraham entered, and indeed this sukkah was a place of welcome. And Sukkot was a time of Zman Simchatenu, a time of rejoicing. Ribono shel Olam, Master of the universe, on this, the first day of Sukkot, I pause to acknowledge what is missing. Guess. May Abraham know that it is because of the responsibility to protect others as well as ourselves. And we know that the highest mitzvah is preserving of human life. That it is because of the need to maintain physical distance that we don't invite people into our small little huts. But next year, God willing, we will. And may you, Avraham, know that you are welcome. For indeed, to have guests is to become Zman Simchatenu. Ribono Shel Olam, may we celebrate, knowing that we are indeed connected from Sukkah to Sukkah, from home to home, from person to person, that we are a people united in acknowledging the goodness of being united. Amen.